John chapter 19, verses 14 to 19. And it was the preparation of the Passover, and about the 6th hour. And he said unto the Jews, Behold your king. But they cried out, Away with him, away with him, crucify him. Pilate said unto them, Shall I crucify your king? The chief priests answered, We have no king but Caesar. Then delivered he him therefore unto them to be crucified. And they took Jesus and led him away. And he, bearing his cross, went forth into a place called the place of a skull, which is called in the Hebrew Golgotha, where they crucified him and two other with him, on either side one, and Jesus in the midst. And Pilate wrote a title, and put it on the cross, and the writing was, Jesus of Nazareth, the King of the Jews. John is very clear about the day Christ was crucified. According to him, it happened on the preparation of the Passover during daytime. However, there are many arguments that seem to show that Christ was crucified on the day of the Passover itself, which starts on the night when the Passover meal is eaten. In this video, I will be discussing and analyzing every single one of these arguments. And for convenience of watching, I made a breakdown of the different topics I discussed, showing their minute mark or timestamp in this video. This can be seen on the comment section down below. This way, you can jump around the topics you are particularly interested in by using these marks. So now let me start the discussion. The preparation of the Passover is when the Passover sacrifice is slain, and this usually happens on the 14th of the Hebrew month Nisan or Abib. Exodus chapter 12 verses 1 to 6, Jubilee Bible Translation. And the Lord spoke unto Moses and Aaron in the land of Egypt, saying, This month shall be unto you the beginning of the months. It shall be the first month of the year to you. Speak unto all the congregation of Israel, saying, In the 10th day of this month, let each man take a lamb according to the families of the fathers, a lamb per family. The lamb shall be without blemish, a male of 1 year. Ye shall take it out from the sheep or from the goats, and ye shall keep it up until the 14th day of the same month, and the whole assembly of the congregation of Israel shall kill it between the 2 evenings. Based on this commandment, the Passover sacrifice should be slaughtered on the 14th of Nisan between the 2 evenings, or in Hebrew, Ben ha-arbayim. This expression, Ben ha-arbayim, is commonly translated as at twilight, dusk, or evening. And this can be seen at the Hebrew Interlinear Bible, which by the way is read from right to left and top to bottom. Very few translations, among which are the Darby Translation, Jubilee Bible Translation, and the Young's Literal Translation, choose to translate it literally as between the 2 evenings. However, One can see the literal translation of this Hebrew expression as a side note if you look at Strong's Concordance for this verse. Now, what is the meaning of the expression between the two evenings? Most people associate the word evening to nighttime. However, the original Hebrew word Erev for evening can also mean even. Thus, Erev or evening can refer to the dividing of the 24-hour day into equal or even parts. And if there is only one evening, then the 24-hour day will be evenly divided into two parts, each part having 12 hours. But since the Bible mentioned two evenings, this means the 24-hour day was evenly divided into four parts, each having 6 hours each. Since the 24-hour Jewish day starts at sunset of the previous day and ends at sunset of that day, the first of four parts having 6 hours each starts at sunset of the previous day and ends on midnight. And the second part starts from midnight and ends on sunrise of that day. And the third part starts from sunrise and ends on noon of that day. And finally, the fourth part starts from noon and ends on sunset of that day. Now, any of these four even parts with which the 24-hour day was divided can be used for the expression between the two evenings, depending now on the circumstance or context it is applied. However, in the particular case of when the Paschal sacrifice is supposed to be slaughtered on Nisan 14, which of these four even parts was actually used by Moses? To answer this question biblically, we have to remember that Christ is the fulfillment of the Passover law, and the exact time of Christ's death must have occurred between these two evenings. Luke chapter 23, verses 44 to 46. And it was about the 6th hour, and there was a darkness over all the earth until the 9th hour. And the sun was darkened, and the veil of the temple was rent in the midst. And when Jesus had cried with a loud voice, he said, Father, into thy hands I commend my spirit. And having said thus, he gave up the ghost. Luke, as well as the other gospel writers, tell us that Christ died on the 9th hour, which corresponds to a time exactly between noon and sunset. During springtime, which was when Christ was crucified, the 9th hour is approximately 3 o'clock in the afternoon. Interestingly, according to Josephus, the 9th hour is also when the high priests start to slay the Paschal sacrifices. Wars of the Jews, Book 6, Chapter 9, Section 3. So these high priests, upon the coming of their feast, which is called Passover, when they slay their sacrifices from the 9th hour to the 11th. This practice of slaying the Paschal sacrifice on the afternoon of the 14th of Nisan, starting at approximately 3 o'clock until 5 o'clock, is further confirmed by the following Wikipedia article, and I quote, "The animal was slain on the eve of the Passover on the afternoon of the 14th of Nisan, after the Tamid sacrifice had been killed, that is, at 3 o'clock, or in case the eve of the Passover fell on Friday night, at 2. Thus, the term between the two evenings during which the Paschal sacrifice is slaughtered refers to the fourth part, or the last 6 hours of the 24-hour Jewish day, which is between noon and sunset, and more specifically, the 9th hour, which is approximately 3 o'clock in the afternoon. In the website www.yeshiva.co, and in their section Ask the Rabbi, a question was raised, and I quote, "What does it mean by between the evenings, bein ha-arbayim?" The answer given by Rabbi Chaim Tabaski is as follows. In the Torah, Bein ha-arbayim is used for the time of the second daily Tamid offering. The first is in the morning, the time of the slaughter of the Pesach sacrifice, and other functions in the temple. Commonly, it is translated as between the evenings or between the settings, when the first setting of the sun is the beginning of its descent after noon, and the second is sundown. Hence, the phrase means the afternoon. Now, if the time of slaughtering of the Paschal sacrifice starts between noon and sunset of the 14th day of Nisan, when does the day of the Passover actually begin? Exodus chapter 12, verses 6 to 12. And ye shall keep it up until the 14th day of the same month, and the whole assembly of the congregation of Israel shall kill it between the 2 evenings. And they shall eat the flesh in that night, roasted with fire, and unleavened bread, and with bitter herbs they shall eat it. And ye shall let nothing of it remain until the morning, and that which remains of it until the morning ye shall burn with fire. And thus shall ye eat it, with your loins girded, your shoes on your feet, and your staff in your hand, and ye shall eat it in haste. It is the Lord's Passover. For I will pass through the land of Egypt this night, and will smite all the firstborn in the land of Egypt, both among man and beast, and against all the gods of Egypt I will execute judgments. I am the Lord. The Paschal sacrifice that was slain between noon and sunset of Nisan 14 is to be eaten and fully consumed that night, which is when the Lord passed through the land of Egypt. Thus, Passover day starts at the end of Nisan 14 and not at the beginning. Now, a quick note before I proceed. When Moses wrote the book of Exodus, he was dealing with 2 different calendars, namely the Egyptian solar civil calendar and the Hebrew lunar calendar. The Egyptians appear to have used a purely lunar calendar prior to the establishment of the solar civil calendar with a 365-day year, and in which each month began on the morning when the waning crescent moon could no longer be seen. The Roman Gregorian calendar, which is commonly used today, is also a solar calendar, except that this calendar starts its day from midnight to midnight. The Egyptian solar civil calendar was established at some early date in or before the Old Kingdom, which is dated circa 2686 BC, and which is long before the Exodus, which I believe occurred on 1487 BC. Thus, the ancient Egyptians at the time of the Exodus reckoned their days from morning to morning, while the Hebrews reckoned their days from sunset to sunset. Now, all the events on Passover day that happened at the time of the Exodus took place in Egypt, and this is why Moses used the Egyptian reckoning when dating all the events as well as all the festivals which God commanded Israel to observe that time. Now, the night of Nisan 14 in the Egyptian reckoning was actually the start or eve of Nisan 15 in the Hebrew calendar, and it was during this night that the Lord passed through the land of Egypt, smiting all the firstborn among man and beast. Thus, Passover Day is commemorated in the Hebrew calendar on the 15th of the month Nisan or Abib, which starts on sunset of Nisan 14 in the Egyptian reckoning and ends on sunset of Nisan 15, also in the Egyptian reckoning. This is confirmed by the following Wikipedia article about the Passover. The Passover begins on the 15th day of the month of Nisan, which typically falls in March or April of the Gregorian calendar. Passover is a spring festival, So the 15th day of Nisan typically begins on the night of a full moon after the northern vernal equinox. Now, part of the observances during the Passover meal at the night of Nisan 14 in the Egyptian reckoning is the obligatory eating of unleavened bread. Furthermore, God commanded the Israelites to eat unleavened bread an additional of 7 more nights after this Passover meal. These 7 additional nights of eating unleavened bread is called the Gag or Feast of Unleavened Bread. Thus, all in all, during the Passover season, the Israelites are commanded to eat unleavened bread a total of 8 straight nights, which according to the Egyptian reckoning starts from sunset of Nisan 14, which is the start or eve of Passover day, until sunset of Nisan 21, which is the start or eve of the 7th day of the Feast of Unleavened Bread. Exodus chapter 12, verses 16 to 18. And in the first day there shall be a holy convocation, and in the 7th day there shall be a holy convocation to you. No manner of work shall be done in them, except that which every person must eat, that only may be done of you. And ye shall observe the feasts of unleavened bread, for in this same day have I brought your hosts out of the land of Egypt. Therefore shall ye observe this day for your ages by an ordinance forever. In the first month, on the 14th day of the month, in the evening, ye shall eat unleavened bread until the 21st day of the month in the evening. Furthermore, God declared the first and 7th day of the Feast of Unleavened Bread a high Sabbath or festival Sabbath, where no work is to be done, regardless of which day of the week these 2 days fall. Now the first day of the Feast of Unleavened Bread should be observed on Nisan 16, which according to the Egyptian reckoning starts on sunset of Nisan 15 and ends on sunset of Nisan 16. And the 7th day of the Feast of Unleavened Bread should be observed on Nisan 22, which starts on sunset of Nisan 21 and ends on sunset of Nisan 22, according to the Egyptian reckoning. Now note that God did not declare the day of the Passover itself a high or festival Sabbath. Thus, work can be done starting from sunset of Nisan 14 until sunset of Nisan 15, unless of course the day of the Passover happens to fall on a weekly Sabbath. Now some will argue that since the Babylonian exile, the Jews started celebrating the Passover and the first day of the Feast of Unleavened Bread on the same day. Thus, Passover Day is considered a holiday or high Sabbath among the Jews since then. But remember, during the time of Christ, there were 2 conflicting schools of thought regarding how the law was to be interpreted, and these were the Pharisees and the Sadducees. The Pharisees were a school of thought in the Holy Land during the time of Second Temple Judaism. After the destruction of the Second Temple in 70 AD, Pharisaic beliefs became the foundational, liturgical, and ritualistic basis for Rabbinic Judaism, which has been the mainstream form of Judaism since the 6th century AD, after the codification of the Babylonian Talmud. The Sadducees, on the other hand, were a sect or group of Jews that was active in Judea during the Second Temple period, starting from the 2nd century BC through the destruction of the temple in 70 AD. Their sect is believed to have become extinct sometime after the destruction of Herod's temple in Jerusalem in 70 AD. Joseph Caiaphas, known simply as Caiaphas in the New Testament, was the Jewish high priest who organized the plot to kill Jesus. Caiaphas was involved in the Sanhedrin trial of Jesus. He was the son-in-law of Annas, who also held the office of high priest earlier. Annas and Caiaphas may have sympathized with the Sadducees, a religious movement in Judea that found most of its members among the wealthy Jewish elite. Now the Sadducees rejected the oral law as proposed by the Pharisees. Rather, they saw the written Torah as the sole source of divine authority. Thus, during the brief period between 6 AD up to 36 AD, when Annas, Eleazar the son of Annas, and Caiaphas held the office of high priest, the Passover and the first day of the Feast of Unleavened Bread may have been observed separately as it should have. This, of course, was contrary to Pharisaic belief that time as well as the belief of the current rabbinic Judaism. As a proof that Passover was not considered a high or festival Sabbath at the time of Christ, we can see from the Gospel of John that Christ performed many signs on the day of the Passover itself. John chapter 2 verse 23. Now while he was in Jerusalem at the Passover festival, many people saw the signs he was performing and believed in his name. John chapter 4 verse 45. When he arrived in Galilee, the Galileans welcomed him. They had seen all that he had done in Jerusalem at the Passover festival, for they also had been there. Nobody, neither the Pharisees nor the Sadducees, nor the people themselves, questioned Christ's miracles that were performed on the day of Passover at that time. In contrast, on one occasion on a Sabbath day, when the Pharisees wanted to have a reason to bring charges against Christ, they asked him if it is lawful to heal on the Sabbath. Matthew chapter 12 verses 9 to 14. Going on from that place, he went into their synagogue, and a man with a shriveled hand was there. Looking for a reason to bring charges against Jesus, they asked him, "Is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath?" He said to them, "If any of you has a sheep, and it falls into a pit on the Sabbath, will you not take hold of it and lift it out? How much more valuable is a person than a sheep? Therefore, it is lawful to do good on the Sabbath." Then he said to the man, "Stretch out your hand." So he stretched it out, and it was completely restored, just as sound as the other. But the Pharisees went out and plotted how they might kill Jesus. Now we know from the Gospels that the afternoon of Christ's death and burial was immediately followed by a Sabbath after sunset. Luke chapter 24 verses 50 to 56. Now there was a man named Joseph, a member of the council, a good and upright man, who had not consented to their decision and action. He came from the Judean town of Arimathea, and he himself was waiting for the kingdom of God. Going to Pilate, he asked for Jesus' body. Then he took it down, wrapped it in linen cloth, and placed it in a tomb cut in the rock, one in which no one had yet been laid. It was preparation day, and the Sabbath was about to begin. The women who had come with Jesus from Galilee followed Joseph and saw the tomb and how his body was laid in it. Then they went home and prepared spices and perfumes, but they rested on the Sabbath in obedience to the commandment. Now there are those who claim that the Sabbath immediately following Christ's death and burial was not a weekly Saturday Sabbath, but a high or festival Sabbath instead. And this, according to them, is the reason why John called this Sabbath a great Sabbath. John chapter 19 verse 31, Young's literal translation. The Jews, therefore, that the bodies might not remain on the cross on the Sabbath, since it was the preparation, for that Sabbath day was a great one, asked of Pilate that their legs may be broken, and day taken away. Now the only high Sabbaths during the entire Passover season, as I mentioned earlier, were the first and seventh day of the Feast of Unleavened Bread. Save the great Sabbath mentioned in John chapter 19 verse 31 was a high or festival Sabbath and was presumably the first day of the Feast of Unleavened Bread. That means Christ should have been crucified and buried in the afternoon of Nisan 15, which is the day of the Passover. This is because the first day of the Feast of Unleavened Bread starts on sunset of Nisan 15 and ends on sunset of Nisan 16, according to the Roman calendar. But as I mentioned earlier, John specifically said that Christ died and was buried on the preparation of the Passover during the afternoon when the Paschal sacrifice was slain, and not on the day of the Passover itself when the Paschal sacrifice was eaten at night and fully consumed before dawn of the following morning. Note also that if Christ died on the afternoon of Passover day, this would mean that his sacrifice was one day later than when the Paschal sacrifices were slaughtered. And this shouldn't be the case, because Christ supposedly came to fulfill the law. Also, the fact that on the morning of Christ's trial before Pilate and just before he was crucified, the Jewish leaders haven't eaten the Passover meal yet, means that Christ was not and could not have been crucified on the day of the Passover. John chapter 18 verse 28. Then the Jewish leaders took Jesus from Caiaphas to the palace of the Roman governor. By now it was early morning, and to avoid ceremonial uncleanness, they did not enter the palace, because they wanted to be able to eat the Passover. Thus, the Sabbath immediately following Christ's burial must have been a weekly Saturday Sabbath and not a high or festival Sabbath. But why was this weekly Saturday Sabbath a great Sabbath according to John? To understand what a great Sabbath meant to the Jews, let us take a look at this verse using the Orthodox Jewish Bible translation. John chapter 19 verse 31, Orthodox Jewish Bible. Therefore, those of Yehuda, since it was preparation day, and they did not want the geviot to be left on Ha'etz tree during Shabbos, for it was Shabbat HaGadol, requested Pilate to have the legs broken and the geviot taken away. Now what is a Shabbat HaGadol? Shabbat HaGadol, literally translated as Great Sabbath, is the weekly Saturday Sabbath immediately before Passover. This means that Shabbat HaGadol can range from one day before Passover, like in the calendar year 2008, to a maximum of 7 days before Passover, like in the calendar year 2016, depending of course on what day of the week the Passover falls. So John is telling us that Christ was crucified the day before a Saturday Shabbat HaGadol, which means without a shadow of a doubt that Christ was crucified on a Friday. Also, since this Shabbat HaGadol was the Saturday Sabbath before Passover and was also just one day after the preparation of the Passover, this means Nisan 15, or the Passover at the time of Christ's crucifixion, occurred on Sunday, or just one day after this Saturday Shabbat HaGadol. I mentioned earlier that the day of preparation of the Passover is usually observed on Nisan 14, or the day before Passover. However, if Nisan 14 falls on a Saturday and is therefore a Shabbat HaGadol, the day of preparation of the Passover is moved a day earlier, or on Nisan 13, since it is forbidden to work or make preparations for the Passover on a Sabbath. Thus, Christ was actually crucified and was buried on Friday, the 13th of Nisan, and not the 14th of Nisan, as many people believe. To know more about Shabbat HaGadol, please watch one of my earlier videos titled Christ's Friday the 13th of Nisan Crucifixion, Shabbat HaGadol, and Passover Sunday Resurrection. Earlier, I mentioned that the Paschal sacrifice that is slaughtered on the afternoon of Nisan 14 and eaten that night at the start or eve of Nisan 15 is first selected on Nisan 10. The start or eve of Nisan 10, according to Egyptian reckoning, is on sunset of Nisan 9, and the start or eve of Nisan 15, according to Egyptian reckoning, is on sunset of Nisan 14. Thus, from sunset of Nisan 9 until sunset of Nisan 14, there are a total of 5 24-hour days. This means the Paschal sacrifice is selected for slaughtering 5 days before Passover Day. If Christ was indeed crucified on Nisan 13, which is a day earlier than Nisan 14, when the Paschal sacrifice is usually slaughtered, then the plot to kill Christ by his enemies should have happened 6 days before Passover, or a day earlier than the 5 days before Passover, when the Paschal sacrifice is usually selected for slaughtering. Now, the plot to kill Christ by the Sanhedrin happened shortly after Christ resurrected Lazarus from the dead. John chapter 11, verses 43 to 53. When he had said this, Jesus called in a loud voice, "Lazarus, come out." The dead man came out, his hands and feet wrapped with strips of linen and a cloth around his face. Jesus said to them, "Take off the grave clothes and let him go." Therefore many of the Jews who had come to visit Mary and had seen what Jesus did believed in him. But some of them went to the Pharisees and told them what Jesus had done. Then the chief priests and the Pharisees called a meeting of the Sanhedrin. Then one of them, named Caiaphas, who was high priest that year, spoke up. "You know nothing at all. You do not realize that it is better for you that one man die for the people than that the whole nation perish." He did not say this on his own, but as high priest that year he prophesied that Jesus will die for the Jewish nation, and not only for that nation, but also for the scattered children of God, to bring them together and make them one. So from that day on, they plotted to take his life. Lazarus and his family made a supper in Christ's honor 6 days before Passover, and this was presumably shortly, if not right after Christ resurrected Lazarus, which resulted to the Sanhedrin plotting to kill Christ. It was also during this supper night that the Sanhedrin plotted to kill Lazarus as well. John chapter 12, verses 1 to 11. 6 days before the Passover, Jesus came to Bethany, where Lazarus was, whom Jesus had raised from the dead. There they made him a supper. Martha served, and Lazarus was one of those at table with him. When the great crowd of the Jews learned that he was there, they came not only on account of Jesus, but also to see Lazarus, whom he had raised from the dead. So the chief priests planned to put Lazarus also to death, because on account of him, many of the Jews were going away and believing in Jesus. Thus, the Sanhedrin plotted to kill Christ and Lazarus 6 days before the Passover, at the same time when the Paschal sacrifices were being selected for slaughtering, which was 1 day earlier than usual because Nisan 14 fell on a Sabbath that year. Correspondingly, Christ must have been crucified on Nisan 13, or a day earlier than when the Paschal sacrifices were usually slaughtered, which is on Nisan 14. Now some people claim that the weekly Saturday Sabbath following Christ's death and burial was called a Great Sabbath because it coincided with the day of Passover and not because it was a Shabbat HaGadol, which is the Saturday Sabbath before the Passover. The following is an article by Tim Staples from the www.catholic.com website, and I quote, "According to John, Passover fell on Saturday, which is why he refers to it as a great Sabbath. Confer John chapter 19 verse 31. It was not only the Sabbath, but it was Passover as well." However, if Saturday was the day of Passover, this means that Sunday, the following day, was the first day of the Feast of Unleavened Bread, which happens to be a high or festival Sabbath. Now I will show you why this couldn't be the case. During a Sabbath, a person is limited to walk outside the city limits where he is observing the Sabbath, a maximum of only 0.598 miles. The following is a quote from the www.shabbat.org website. "How far am I allowed to walk on Shabbat? Jewish law sets the maximum walking range from one city to 2,000 cubits or 0.596 miles. However, this measurement starts 70 and 2/3 cubits from the city limits. Practically speaking, this means that you may not walk a straight line more than 0.598 miles in any direction in the wilds outside your city limits. Now the problem is, if supposedly the Sunday immediately following the day of Passover on Saturday was a high or festival Sabbath, then why was Christ and two of his disciples walking away from Jerusalem at a distance of about 7 miles, which is a lot more than the maximum limit of 0.598 miles. Luke chapter 24, verses 13 to 29. Now that same day, two of them were going to a village called Emmaus, about 7 miles from Jerusalem. As they talked and discussed these things with each other, Jesus himself came up and walked along with them. He asked them, "What are you discussing together as you walk along?" One of them, named Cleopas, asked him, "Are you the only one visiting Jerusalem who does not know the things that have happened there in these days?" "What things?" he asked. "About Jesus of Nazareth," they replied. "He was a prophet, powerful in word and deed before God and all the people." The chief priests and other rulers handed him over to be sentenced to death, and they crucified him. But we had hoped that he was the one who was going to redeem Israel. And what is more, it is the third day since all these took place. As they approached the village to which they were going, Jesus continued on as if he were going further. But they urged him strongly, "Stay with us, for it is nearly evening. The day is almost over." So he went in to stay with them. Thus, the day following Christ's death and burial could not have been the day of Passover, since the following day, or the third day since Christ's death and burial, could not have been a high or festival Sabbath, which is what the first day of unleavened bread is. Now there are those who claim that the Last Supper which Christ ate with his disciples on the night before his crucifixion was actually the Passover meal, and therefore Christ's death and burial that happened the following afternoon was within the 24-hour day of Passover itself. This is in spite of the fact, which I mentioned earlier, that the Jewish leaders claimed on the morning of Christ's trial that they are yet to eat the Passover meal, and not to mention the other fact that this would imply that Christ's sacrifice was a day later than when the Paschal sacrifices were offered. But could it be that Christ ate the Passover meal ahead of its lawfully appointed time, which is during the day of Passover? Luke chapter 22 verses 14 to 16. "And when the hour was come, he sat down, and the 12 apostles with him. And he said unto them, with desire, Greek epitomia, I have desired, Greek epitomio, to eat this Passover with you before I suffer. For I say unto you, I will not anymore eat thereof until it be fulfilled in the kingdom of God. According to Strong's Concordance, the Greek words epitomia and epitomiho have the following meanings, namely, a longing, especially for what is forbidden, and of those who seek things forbidden. In contrast, there exists another Greek word, ahiteho, which has the following meanings according to Strong's Concordance, and they are to ask, beg, call for, crave, desire, and require. This Greek word ahiteho was used in the following verse. Mark chapter 10 verse 35. And James and John, the sons of Zebedee, come unto him, saying, Master, we would that thou shouldest do for us whatsoever we shall desire. Greek ahiteho. Notice that the meaning of the Greek word ahiteho does not have the negative connotation of doing something forbidden, unlike the Greek words epitomia and epitomeho. So clearly, Christ was desiring something unlawful when he wanted to eat the Passover meal with his disciples the night before his crucifixion. Was Christ justified in unlawfully eating the Passover meal with his disciples ahead of its appointed time? Christ was aware that he is about to die, and that he will already be dead when the lawfully appointed time for eating the Passover meal has come. In one occasion, Christ has clarified that certain laws like the Sabbath can be broken if breaking it involves a matter between life and death, or if it involves something of greater spiritual importance than the law being broken. Matthew chapter 12 verses 1 to 12. At that time, Jesus went through the grain fields on the Sabbath. His disciples were hungry and began to pick some heads of grain and eat them. When the Pharisees saw this, they said to him, Look, your disciples are doing what is unlawful on the Sabbath. He answered, Haven't you read what David did when he and his companions were hungry? He entered the house of God, and he and his companions ate the consecrated bread, which was not lawful for them to do, but only for the priests. Or haven't you read in the law that the priests on Sabbath duty in the temple desecrate the Sabbath and yet are innocent? I tell you that something greater than the temple is here. If you had known what these words mean, I desire mercy, not sacrifice, you would not have condemned the innocent, for the Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath. We have to remember that Christ is not only Lord of the Sabbath, he is Lord of the Passover as well. Now there are those who claim that the Last Supper was the first day of the Feast of Unleavened Bread instead, and they cite the following verse to prove it. Matthew chapter 26 verse 17, King James Version. Now the first day of the Feast of Unleavened Bread, Greek adsumos, the disciples came to Jesus, saying unto him, Where wilt thou that we prepare for thee to eat the Passover? However, if you look at Strong's Concordance for this particular verse, you will see that the word feast was not included in the original Greek text, but was just inserted in brackets instead. This is why many translations, like the American Standard Version, the Complete Jewish Bible, the Revised Standard Version, Young's Literal Translation, among others, omit the word feast for this verse. Also, the Greek word used for unleavened bread in this verse, which is adsumos, literally translates as free from leaven or yeast. In other words, there was actually no mention of bread at all in the original Greek text for this verse. Thus, the literal translation for this verse should have been, now on the first day free from leaven or yeast. If unleavened bread and not just free from leaven or yeast was intended by the Gospel writers, they should have included the Greek word artos in this verse, which literally translates as bread, like in the following verse. Matthew chapter 26 verse 26. And as they were eating, Jesus took bread, Greek artos, and blessed it, and brake it, and gave it to the disciples, and said, "Take, eat, this is my body." Now when exactly is the first day the households in Israel are free from leaven or yeast during the entire Passover season? While the night of the Passover or Pesach is the first night God requires Israel to eat unleavened bread, the first night which God requires Israel to be free from leaven or yeast is during the preparation of the Passover, specifically on Betikas Chametz, which is the search before the Passover for chametz, which is leaven or yeast or any leavened food. There is a law that prohibits the offering of the blood of a sacrifice mixed with leaven or yeast. Exodus chapter 23 verse 18, New International Version. "Do not offer the blood of a sacrifice to me along with anything containing yeast." Thus, a diligent search for chametz is done on the night immediately before the afternoon when the Passover sacrifice is slaughtered. And this is to ensure that the Passover sacrifice that will be offered is free from chametz. This search usually takes place after nightfall on the evening before Passover, and the leavened food found during this night search is then burned the following morning. However, when Passover starts on Saturday night, as per Roman reckoning, but which is actually the start or eve of Sunday as per the Jewish calendar, then Betikas Chametz takes place on Thursday night, or 2 nights before Passover, and not on Friday night. This is because Friday night, as per Roman reckoning, is actually the start or eve of Saturday or the Sabbath, as per the Jewish calendar, and chametz or leavened food cannot be burned during Sabbath. And this was actually the case during the Last Supper of Christ, which was when the search for chametz took place, and thus was the first night during the Passover season that households in Israel were free from leaven or yeast. The Gospel of Luke made a clear distinction between the feast, free of leaven or yeast, and the day, free of leaven or yeast, with the following verses. Luke chapter 22 verses 1 to 2. "Now the feast, Greek hehortai, of unleavened bread, Greek adsumos, drew nigh, which is called the Passover, and the chief priests and scribes sought how they might kill him, for they feared the people." As discussed earlier, the Greek word adsumos simply means free of leaven or yeast, so there is really no mention of bread or food in this verse at all. However, since the Greek word hehortai, which means feast, was used before adsumos in this verse, this implies the eating or feasting of something free of leaven or yeast. And according to Luke, the feast free of leaven or yeast is called the Passover. And this is correct, because the Passover meal is really the first night Israel is commanded or obligated to eat unleavened bread. And as I discussed earlier, this night is to be followed by 7 more nights called the Festival of Unleavened Bread, during which time Israel is commanded to eat more unleavened bread. Now compare the previous verse with the following verses. Luke chapter 22 verse 7. "Then came the day, Greek haimera, of unleavened bread, Greek adsumos, when the Passover must be killed." Mark chapter 14 verse 12. "And the first day, Greek haimera, of unleavened bread, Greek adsumos, when they killed the Passover, his disciples said unto him, Where wilt thou that we go and prepare, that thou mayest eat the Passover?" Again, there is no mention of bread in these verses at all, contrary to how these verses were translated, and neither was there a mention of feast as well. Thus, in these verses, both Luke and Mark were really talking about the first day free of leaven or yeast, when every household in Israel must search for leaven or yeast at night and dispose them the following morning. And according to both Luke and Mark, the first day free of leaven and yeast was also the day when the Paschal sacrifice must be killed. And again, they are correct. Because the search for leaven and yeast, which takes place at night, and the killing of the Paschal sacrifice, which takes place the following afternoon, are both on the same 24-hour day. And this day is the Jewish day of preparation of the Passover, which starts and ends on sunset. Thus, all four Gospels by Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John are in perfect agreement. Christ's Last Supper, his crucifixion, death, and burial all took place in that sequence within the 24-hour day of preparation of the Passover. Also, it should be clear by now after this long discussion that Christ died and was buried on a Friday afternoon and that he was already risen by Sunday morning. However, there are many who still cannot accept this conclusion because of the sign of Jonah, which according to them means Christ should have been buried in his grave for 3 days and 3 nights. A Friday burial and a resurrection on or before Sunday morning, they say, simply does not satisfy this. I will be discussing this topic on my next video that will be titled, The 3 Days and 3 Nights Sign of Jonah. Was this fulfilled by Christ?